Hello and welcome to the 2022-2023 Program Monitoring Random Validation Phase 1 Process Training for the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program. In this session, we will provide you with an overview of the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program Priority for Service Requirement. First of all, we want to share some things to keep in mind regarding this random validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and be available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is that to ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting minutes, notes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is acceptable. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. We want to provide some additional guidance regarding the documentation request as part of the MEV requirements. The 2022-2023 random validation for the Title I Part C program will be requesting documentation for the 2021-2022 school year to ensure TEA is provided with adequate documentation to support the selected requirement. If the LEA did not participate in the Title I Part C program in the 2021-2022 school year, the LEA will submit documentation for the 2022-2023 school year. Priority for service. Now let's talk specifically about the requirement for documentation for priority for service. According to ESEA, as amended by ESA, Section 1301(2) and 1304(d), the LEA gives service priority to migratory children who made a qualifying move within the previous one-year period and who were failing or most at risk of failing to meet the challenging state academic standards. Now let's talk about the documentation for this requirement. The first type of documentation required is the Pfs reports. The acceptable documentation are copies of the monthly Pfs reports for the previous school year without the student identifiable information. Reports showing no students found is acceptable. Again, the documentation for this requirement is a copy of the monthly Pfs report from the previous school year without student identifiable information. Issues that might result in an improvement needed status. Audible documentation requested was not submitted, or documentation submitted does not reference the Pfs criteria. The second documentation requirement for Pfs is the District Pfs Action Plan. The acceptable documentation is a copy of the District Pfs Action Plan from the previous school year. Again, the documentation for this requirement is a copy of the Pfs Action Plan for the previous school year. Issues that might result in an improvement needed status. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not reference the Pfs criteria. Documentation submitted does not include detailed activities. Documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in 2021-2022. The following documentation is required only for LEAs with Pfs students. Supplemental Program Report. In submitting the previous school year supplemental program report, redact student identifiable information, and highlight the unique student number. The documentation for requirement 2.3 is submitting the previous school year supplemental program report. Issues that might result in an improvement needed status is if the audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation for requirement 2.4 is the MEP services for PFS students first. This is only a requirement for LEAs that had PFS students. The acceptable documentation is relevant documentation that shows the MEP services were provided to PFS students first in the previous school year. Again, for item 2.4, please provide the relevant documentation that shows the MEP services were provided to PFS students first in the previous school year. Issues that might result in an improvement needed status are audible documentation requested was not submitted. Thank you. These are the requirements to the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program as it relates to priority for service. We hope that you will find this information useful. Here is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.